Hey everybody, this is going to be a bit of a different review from what I typically do. Normally, if you've watched any of my gameplay videos or listened to the show, you know that normally the way I operate is a very stream of consciousness type of thinking. That's just how I talk, that's how I generally do things. I don't normally do a lot of editing, I don't normally do much in the way of preparation, but with Death Stranding I'm going to do things a little differently because I think this game is so uniquely different in what it is and what it's trying to be that I don't just want to kind of talk over it. I'd like to organize my thoughts a little bit. I mean, not a ton. This is not going to be a drastic departure from the way I normally do things, but I do want a little more structure to it to break down what I think are kind of the three things that to me are important to know about the game going in. Those are going to be the technical aspects, that's graphics and visuals. It's going to be the gameplay itself, which is probably going to be the most polarizing element. And actually, I shouldn't say that. I said that's the most polarizing element. The other end of it is going to be the narrative, which I think for some people will also be a problematic or at the very least polarizing aspect. So that's why I think it's important to break these things into three pieces, just so you have an idea of what the totality of the game is. So, and the reviews for this game, the professional reviews and some of the other reviews I've seen, they tend to really get caught up in the idea of whether this is a new genre or not, which I would argue it isn't. Some of them focus on specific aspects of it. It's tough with some of the reviews to really know what they're evaluating the game on. The other thing is, and this is, I think, true of any game review where somebody has to try to sum up the whole game, is often these reviews they're not technically speed runs, but you will hear people say they went through a 50-hour game inside of 3 weeks. That's not typically how people play. I mean, I've been playing this. I mean, if you're a speedrunner, I don't think you're buying this game to begin with, but I've been playing this game at a very kind of lax pace. It came out November 8th, I believe. I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of, I would assume, 30 hours in, and I'm just about to the halfway point of the story. So I'm taking my time with it because I think that that's in some ways what the game is intended for the player to do. So anyway, but I also really have a lot of strong reaction to it. I'm sure if you've followed me anywhere or listened to me talk about it, you already kind of know what my thinking on it is. But I want to kind of break it out. I think the game is something that is different enough that it deserves a little more. So I'm going to do a little bit more of a I'm not going to call it a professional video, but certainly a more polished video than I normally do. So anyway, we're going to take this thing in three separate parts, and we'll get going right now with the technical side. All right, here we go. Death Stranding is a open-world, third-person perspective traversal game. I think that's the best way to put it. The gameplay loop, for the most part, is concerned with you as the main character traversing a landscape between 2 points, or possibly 3 points, or in sometimes an actual literal loop where you're going to get something and coming right back to where you started, over and over and over in service of different assignments that you were given by various characters throughout the world. That is the simplest way to put it. This is Fetch Quest, the game. Although I don't like to say that because it's more than Fetch Quest, the game, because it isn't ever as simple as go here, get that, come back. That may be what it is in the broad strokes, but in fact there is a deep, layered, constantly shifting system of movement that this game makes you employ and recognize and fight with. Frankly, the challenge, the puzzle solving, and it really is, to a degree, puzzle solving, is in trying to get to wherever the assignment that you have, either the endpoint or retrieving a package from an area, how to get there without, not even dying, but how to get there with the least difficulty. Because one of the things that this character can't do is die. Your character can't die. That's not even a spoiler. You find that out in the opening tutorial chapters, is that the character, it actually forces you to die so that you can find out that you can't die. So I don't consider that a spoiler whatsoever. Your character is incapable of being killed. He has a unique biological setup that allows him to come back from death. He's not unique in that way, because they have a term for people like him. But in this game, thus far, unless something changes at the end, at least in the opening, Sam, the character you're playing, is the only character we know of that can do this. Because everybody remarks on how amazing and special that is. So it's clearly a rare talent, but it does not seem, at least it is not presented as a unique one. And so one of the things that typically you would find in a game is removed. The death failure is not there. Now, there are certain gameplay sequences where not necessarily dying, but a certain event can trigger a game over, so you can actually get a game over screen, but it will not be from injury or death in the traditional manner. So if you are killed, or you are beaten down or sucked underneath by the BTs, the ghost creatures, you will be able to come back every time. There are penalties in some cases where gear might be destroyed or lost or damaged, but fundamentally, you can always come back. So that, one of the things that we're used to in games of this type, that's removed. And instead, the emphasis is placed on delivering the packages generally as quickly and with as little damage as possible. And that is the main gameplay loop. That is what happens. That is what you are doing for the majority of the game. So it's not anything like Metal Gear Solid or the other games where there was actually a tactical... it was basically Metal Gear Solid, the series, had a mix of stealth and combat. And that mix would vary depending on what situation you were in. But that was the main loop, was sneak into a place, take out people if you have to, get out. This is go to a place, get a package, or deliver a package to a person, repeat. And for some people, that is probably going to be a non-starter right there. That this game often doesn't want you doing anything other than walking across a landscape. In some cases, you employ a vehicle, but very often the game will put terrain in front of you that makes vehicle traversal either completely impractical, meaning you could do it. I have actually played around with maneuvering the vehicles across very rocky surfaces, but I know it had to have taken me 3 to 4 times as long to just get that to happen than if I had just walked it. So there are vehicles, there are gameplay elements that will help you in these things. You get container spray that if you fall down and damage your packages, you'll be able to spray it on there. So there are things that the game does to make that... It never becomes so aggravating that I ever felt like quitting the game. In fact, the only time I ever really got frustrated and quit was when a traditional combat scenario came up. I found it to be so out of place and frankly almost fighting with the game itself that I just stopped playing for a bit and went, okay, I'll come back to this later. I don't feel like dealing with this. Because it was not what the gameplay normally is and didn't feel like it really fit. Now, from what I've read, this is a rarity. This is only a couple of particular sequences where this happens. Otherwise, the game is far more fluid. So the way the gameplay works, as I said, is you are a delivery person. That's your whole thing. You're bringing something to someone or retrieving something for someone. That is the game. The interesting part, what makes Death Stranding more than simply a traversal game, is the way that it handles what I believe they call asynchronous multiplayer. So the concept here is that you are playing Sam in your reality. Every other person playing Death Stranding is playing Sam in their reality, in their world. And while you will never actually directly encounter another player in the game world, as far as I know, from what I've read, that absolutely does not happen, and so far I've seen nothing to suggest it will see things that they have left in the world. You will see remnants of them. For example, you will be traversing along and you'll come to a chasm where it's probably going to either kill you or greatly damage your cargo if you were to try to, let's say, jump down into it, or even there's a good risk that if you try to jump it and miss, that you will die or damage your cargo and fail the mission. You'll do a pulse because you have a little device that allows you to map the terrain. It actually lets you know when there's water that's too deep to traverse or whether there's really rocky areas so that you can balance yourself. One of the things that you do is you balance yourself. So depending on how you've outlaid your cargo, sorry, I'm taking a small diversion here because this will become important when I'm talking about the multiplayer. When you get cargo, you have the ability to place that cargo all over your person in different assortments. So there is an auto arrange option which most people will probably be using for quite a while until you really understand kind of the balance system and how you want to do things. I know people who have said that they've used it the whole game. That's fine. The game doesn't ever penalize you for using it, which is great. So it lets you not have to... Some people just don't have the mindset for that. So if you want to just be able to not focus on so much the arrangement of things, but the traversal itself, you can use that system. And so depending on how things are laid out, if they're at all uneven or if you're carrying a lot of cargo, depending on the terrain that you're maneuvering over, you will start to lose your balance. And so you will be able to grab the straps of your backpack to try to balance yourself. And that is where the mapping of the ground becomes very important, because if you see that there's a very steep cliff or a lot of rocks, you will have to be prepared to right yourself, because you will probably become unbalanced. And that is one of the ways that your cargo gets damaged, the major way, really. And so where that becomes entangled with other players is, let's say you're coming along, you have a lot of cargo, you don't want to risk jumping across this cliffside because you might damage the cargo or die and have to come back with damaged cargo or lost cargo. You will scan the terrain with your scanner, and you will pick up, depending on where you are in the game and what other players have done, you might see 2 or 3 meters down that there is a ladder that has been placed across the chasm by another player. You can go down and then utilize that ladder in your game, and vice versa. If you have a ladder and you lay it down, somebody a week, a day, a month from now could come along to that same spot and see your ladder and be able to use it. And the way that you show appreciation to the other player is through a like system. I wish it wasn't likes, because that just makes me think of Facebook, which... But you basically can appreciate what somebody has left, and it creates this social currency that resonates in a positive loop in the game. Meaning, the game has no real way for you to grief other players. So you can only really interact with other people positively, either by putting down something others can use or appreciating something that somebody else has put down for you to use. And that to me is quite remarkable. To have a game that has a multiplayer component that really only exists to encourage people to work together is amazing to me. Most games that have multiplayer, one of the things that comes up is trolling, griefing. Almost every game I've ever played that was a multiplayer game, there was some component of that. It would happen here and there. Death Stranding removes, really, in every workable way, that from being possible, because the only ways you could really negatively influence another player's game is to remove a useful tool. And the game has a dynamic system, and I don't really understand how it works, but I've read sort of the basics of it. So let's say you come to a cliffside where 6 other players have put down ladders. You're not going to see 6 ladders. The game is going to selectively show you certain things, from what I've understood the way it works. Because it is sort of pointless that if 6 players built them really, really close to each other, why would you have 6 stacked ladders? Instead, you'll just see 1 or 2 maybe. And so even if you were to dismantle the ladder, what I believe the game will do is go, okay, well, he removed that ladder, so we will now show this ladder. And even if you did it, even if you wanted to do that, even if you came to a cliffside and always dismantled every ladder that you saw, you would get no real indication that what you did had any impact. You would never know. Because maybe the next person would see a ladder, or maybe they would find another way around, and there is no benefit, there's no entertainment even, out of doing it. So the game has removed the trolling system. There really is virtually no way to do it, and anybody who would try, boy, you'd have to be a really special somebody to want to try to troll somebody in this game. So that, along with the traversal system, the positive working together mechanic that the world employs, because you'll come across places where, and I've done this multiple times, my stuff will be ruined because there's a weather mechanic that actually damages your cargo. The rain is corrosive because it accelerates time. So it will actually, the longer you stay out in the rain, everything starts to degrade. Your cargo, your vehicles, everything. So you can build something called a timefall shelter. It's basically a giant umbrella type thing. When you go under that, you are protected from the rain, and your cargo and or vehicle are partially restored by the shelter. I have never really had a problem finding one of these. I've built very few myself because every time I went to do it, I would scan the area and somebody else had done it. Now that's unbelievable to think of, that this is a cooperative game where you never see the people who are helping you, and yet the game actively encourages you to help. I've come to places where I would lay down a climbing rope just because I knew I didn't want to use it, but I could see somebody else wanting to use it. Even if somebody was, overloaded or had a different setup than me, or just didn't really know how to maneuver down a cliffside, because I kind of like to explore how you can get around things without using the tools. But I'll lay down the tool and put a little sign saying, hey, there's a rope here for people who may be in trouble, or maybe the cargo's about to break and they don't want to risk trying to go down the cliff. Here's a rope, take the rope, you can go down, it'll be easy, you'll be fine. That is not something I've really encountered in other games in this way ever. And so it is, again, remarkable to me that it is so successful and so useful. You can also repair everything in the world can degrade. So the roads, the structures, all that will eventually be affected by this timefall and will start to become decayed and decrepit. You can repair those things by contributing materials to them, and I do it every time when I have the materials. Again, not something other games have ever really encouraged me to do, but I actively, anytime I come to a structure that's damaged, I try to contribute materials to improve it. Again, something that I find really worth noting in this game. And so that mechanic, along with the traversal, is really what makes it unique. Otherwise, it is basically a game about going between different places and bringing cargo with you, and inventory management. Although, again, the inventory management can be automated, so you don't really have to think about it that much. You can plot multiple routes in your map, which a lot of people do. I haven't really done that so much, but I can see the utility of it. I just generally have tried to attack things, direct route, straight route, and see if I can do it. And when not, I just kind of go around and I wing it, which I find to be, to me, more rewarding. Some people, though, will really want to meticulously plan out their route, and the game allows you to do that. The combat comes from, the only combat elements really, the minor one is other human NPCs called mules that are rogue delivery men. Yeah, I don't really understand that either, but that's what it is. Where they will attempt to take your packages from you because I think the game says they're addicted to delivering packages. Whatever. This is a Kojima game. We don't need to apply too much logic here. The real combat, for the most part, the stuff that you actually have to worry about and reckon with, although worry about is subjective, you will get enough weaponry pretty quickly that they will become more of a navigation obstacle than a real enemy, are the BTs, are these ghost entities. Because in the world of Death Stranding, the world of the living and the world of the dead coexist. So you as living beings will routinely run into areas, pockets of the map, which are generally, or almost always, I think, involve rainfall. Because when the rainfall comes, BTs, which are these ghost beings, are generally in there, or can be in there. And when you encounter them, that is where combat becomes more prominent, because you have to be very careful. You can navigate around them. You can do it, but it's not easy. It takes a lot of deliberation and time and planning and paying attention to you have a little device that will alert when you're near one. Whereas once you have some of the weapons that are available to you, which are all based on your biology, your blood, urine, and feces power all these weapons. Amazing. Once you have those, it becomes relatively easy to just cut right through them. As long as you've brought enough, that is another gameplay element, is planning. Do you have the tools? How many tools do you want to bring for what you may or may not run into? That's not necessarily, well, I mean, that is a component of inventory management, but it's a very specific one because there is a planning aspect. And so when you run into the BTs, after a very short amount of time, like I said, I'm only in Chapter 4 right now. I only just hit Chapter 4, and I already have a very simple workflow for going through the BTs. They are largely a headache when I have not brought enough ammo for my weapons, or my blood is running low, because you do have to maintain your blood level. Honestly, besides that, they're very simple to get through. So again, the game isn't really trying to push the combat on you, and you can avoid combat altogether. You can, it will just take time and planning, you can navigate around all these obstacles. The mules are a little tougher because they actually will try to scan for you, but you will unlock a way to divert that scan or block that scan, so it can be done. The BTs are a little easier, but it takes a lot longer because there's stamina meters involved with that. You have to hold your breath, so it will just take longer. But if you want to take on that challenge, you absolutely can do it. And the game will allow you to do it. It lets you approach it however you want. So that is the main gameplay loop. That is what you are doing, is navigating constantly changing terrain and trying to plan to be able to overcome any obstacles that are in your way, whether they are the land itself or other beings in the world, while preserving the packages that you are delivering or retrieving as much as possible. That's the whole game. For some people, that will not work. If you're looking for action, if you're looking something for fast pace that's easy, that you can just drop in and drop out of, this is likely not the game for you gameplay wise, because I have spent an hour or more doing one delivery depending on where it went and what was involved in getting there. That works fine for me. But for some people, that may be a deal breaker right away. Just the idea that this is not, I mean, even Metal Gear Solid, even those games with their stealth elements, had a lot of sequences where you could kind of wing it and just blow through it if you had the right weapons or the right, knowledge of the area. There's very little of that in Death Stranding. It is much more deliberate in its gameplay loop, and so you have to be aware of what the game is. And that is in service of the atmosphere. That is because there is a specific feeling that I think Kojima wants you to have of isolation, of a world where human connection has broken down. And so the gameplay serves that by making everything slow, deliberate, and empty. And if you like that idea, then you're going to find a lot to love in the gameplay. But if what you're looking for is something that's more run and gun, or, I mean, not even run and gun, but even if you're looking for something like Metal Gear Solid, because in Metal Gear Solid 5, there were multiple sequences where the tension would ratchet for a while, and then you'd be discovered, and suddenly you're in this wild firefight where you're running around trying to get people, grabbing people and knocking them out, and it would become very frenetic. In Death Stranding, that frenzy is exactly what you want to avoid, especially with the BTs, but also with the human characters, because they will start to overwhelm you. So it is much more on the avoid conflict mindset than it is on, well, if conflict happens, you're going to be able to handle it. You probably will, but it will feel like you are fighting the game when you do it. The combat feels more like it is you against the game and the mechanics of the game than the characters within it. So that is really the important thing to know about gameplay, is this is again, Fetch Quest the game is simplistic and I don't think really fair, but it is the easiest summary of the game in its bare bones, which is you are expected to walk from one place to another and figure out how to do it and avoid obstacles along the way. That is the whole game. Outside of small cutscenes, small, very, very minor pieces of it so far, to the point where, again, the one combat sequence that's really combat-oriented that feels more like a traditional third-person, almost military shooter, like something like Ghost Recon, feels very out of place. So you have to be aware that that's not, the game wants you to slow down, look at what you're doing, look where you are, and walk through it. So if that does not sound appealing to you, this game's not going to work for you. If it does, if you're in for a easily understood narrative, we'll get to that later. It still may not be for you, but the gameplay loop is very similar to something like Shadow of the Colossus, sort of, where you will have long stretches where you're not really doing much, but you're just expected to kind of drink in the atmosphere. It's not a one-to-one comparison. I'm not comparing this to Shadow of the Colossus, but that's the one where when I think of it, I'm like, okay, or even No Man's Sky to a degree, where No Man's Sky at points you can just fly around or walk around and you won't encounter, but there's more wildlife. I mean, there's not really a lot of wildlife in Death Stranding. Most of the wildlife is gone. So you don't really encounter even, random animals as much. Maybe the little cryptobiotes that you eat, but that's about it. And little things here and there, but not a lot of it. So the desolation is part of the gameplay. And so you have just to understand that this is a game that, even in its gameplay loop, will force you to bring some stuff to it instead of providing it for you. I don't really know how else to put it. But anyway, that's about as much as I can say about the gameplay. It's very satisfying in what it is, but it's very specific and doesn't care if you don't like what it is. If you're coming for something outside of that delivery mechanism, you're going to be hugely disappointed. So I think I've probably covered it as much as I need to talking this long about it. So let's move on to, in the next segment, we will talk about the graphics, the visuals, and the sound design. So we'll do that next. In terms of the game itself, the technical side of it, as far as its graphics and its sound design, it is one of the best games that I've ever looked at on the PS4 Pro in particular. I would say that this game probably is only second to God of War in terms of sheer beauty just on the visuals themselves. The environments are wonderfully rendered. The color work is stellar. The variety in terrain and the way that it seamlessly transitions, where you're kind of walking around and you will suddenly notice that the ground is getting a little rougher, and then you'll see some rocks and a cliff face, and it'll be shrouded in fog. And then you kind of, as you're climbing up, the environment will change. You'll notice that there's a very gradual transition between the different areas. And I think the areas themselves are all interesting in different ways. Even some that have coloration that has traditionally been, problematic in video games, specifically browns and grays. There was a period of time within the last 5 to 6 years where you're seeing lots of games that were just brown and gray and brown and gray. Or, to go even further back, if those who played Fallout 3, that sort of muddy color palette where everything was sort of just a slightly different shade of the same color. Death Stranding presents vivid greens, reds. You get the rain itself, the cloudiness adjusts the whole color temperature of the area. Everything will gray and darken. Some of the lighting effects are quite wonderful to look at, especially when you're looking up at the sky and you'll see the sun come down, or you're in shadow. When you go into certain crevices, which you'll probably see at some point in this video, it will get very logically dark, where it's actually very difficult to see because there's very little light permeating. In fact, one of the few things that I think was a mistake from a gameplay perspective, unless I just haven't gotten to it yet, is there's no type of flare or lantern that I've encountered yet, which I'm sort of surprised there isn't something like that for these darker spaces. Now, don't get me wrong, you can use the Obradec scanner to map the environment so you achieve a degree of visibility. But for a game that very realistically depicts the problem where you don't have any natural light, there's no real way to counter it. Now, that's a minor complaint. I don't really care. In fact, like I said, the thing about it is it does make sense. If you're way down in a crack between the earth and a crevice, there's going to be very little light if there's no light source overhead. So I don't really mind it. Again, the way that some of the fog and the haze and the environmental effects to convey distance are used are really stellar. There are times where you have a really long horizon that you can see down, and it's actually quite magnificent, to the point where there are several moments where it becomes very photorealistic as far as the actual environment goes. There's a sense of reality and weight to everything. And again, some of the light and the way light's used and some of the color variations to depict areas that are more burned out and others that are more vibrant are really well done. There's lots of little detail all over the place. When the timefall starts, and in particular if you run into the BTs, you will see plants that are growing and dying in this really accelerated fashion. Very small, easy to miss, but once you see it, you appreciate it. The way that the sound design comes in with some of the wind and some of the sound effects that interact with the environment is very well done. The sound itself is really interesting. The soundtrack is very minimal. There's not a constant background music. There are songs that play. I mentioned that I think in the first part that Kojima has this thing about long stretches where there's nothing really happening. He'll insert an artist he likes. This goes back to Metal Gear Solid, I think 3, where you were climbing, I don't know, 3 or 4, where there was a long sequence. I think it was 3. We were climbing up a staircase for 5 or 6 minutes and a song was playing, and it was just overindulgent and ridiculous and whatever. That's what you're going to get. But the moments in between those kind of set pieces are very minimal as far as the soundtrack, which I like because you actually start to hear the emptiness. Again, this game has a very heavy emphasis on isolation and emptiness, and a world that has become so divided. Not even divided is the wrong word, but has lost a sense of community to such an extent that it's almost a dead world. It isn't. There are pockets of people that live in different places, but they are so spread out, they are so disconnected from each other, that this emptiness is filled by the lack of sound. Now, there are soundtrack moments that kick up when you encounter the mules, the enemies, or when you're in the BT areas. There is music that comes up. There are sound effects that come up, which are very harsh at times, very grating, very alien, which I think is exactly what was intended, to make those moments punch against the silence of, where you'll be walking and you'll just hear your footsteps and running water of a river or a lake that's in front of you, or you'll hear the wind coming through, or the rainfall. The rainfall is actually quite wonderful, especially if you have a nice sound set up. It really just envelops everything And not only the rain in the game serves such a weird function, because rain normally is kind of a cleansing thing. It's something that comes in and washes the dirt away. But in this game, it's the familiar sounds, but the effects of the rain are actually quite detrimental. Literal acid rain. So the soundscape is great. The voice acting is largely very good. The models of the characters themselves are very good. They're not the best I've ever seen, except on Norman Reedus, because they must have spent from what I've seen, they've spent a tremendous amount of time modeling him. The one thing that, and this is not unique to this game, but it baffles me because so many games struggle with it, is the way that hair moves when characters move their head. It never, ever, ever looks real. It always looks like they're underwater. And I always wonder why they bother to have loose hair if they can't model it correctly. Again, this is not necessarily a specific criticism of Death Stranding. I've seen this in many games. It's just baffling to me. I don't understand it. So that's the one weak point. Really, the one thing you see where you can instantly get kicked out of the realism is the hair. Contrast that with, and there's actually a very good video by Digital Foundry that talks about this, the eyes in this game are stellar. They look realistic. They look alive, which is another point that many games struggle with. God of War also did it very well. There are games that do it well, but this is probably one of the better examples as far as it actually, to some degree, will point out the flaws in the rest of the face, because the eyes are so well done that you start to notice some of the seams in the wrinkles and the facial expressions, that they kind of look a little plasticky. That's another thing, that nobody's skin looks real. That's another area that many games struggle with. There's a slight plastic sheen to everything. But honestly, I think where the focus was put was on the environment. The actual ground, the grass, the clouds, the soundscape texture, everything outside of the people. That was where a lot of the power was put, and it absolutely is effective. There's the way the degradation happens on the materials is very fluid and organic, happens almost to the point where you don't notice it, which is great, because the time fall makes metal rust because it's accelerating time. So as you're driving, as you're holding the containers on your back, they will start to degrade and erode, and eventually they will start to rust, and you'll see a lot of rust forming on them to the point where then they will be destroyed or ruined. That happens really, really smoothly. In fact, I have yet to really catch it, because it's not something that they really push forward, so you'd have to be paying attention. And when you're playing the game, you never really think about it until you start to notice it once it's done. But there's no point where you kind of see the rust growing in a way that seems very artificial. Instead, it just kind of naturally blooms, almost. The water's very good. The water actually looks pretty realistic. Except in some cutscenes, you'll notice that the water looks a little weird. But most of the body modeling, the facial representations of the actors are very good. You'll notice that some of the voices aren't the right people. Guillermo del Toro is in it physically, but he's being voiced by somebody else. So is Nicholas, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it, Winding Refn. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He's voiced by somebody else, but his actual facial capture for those guys, you recognize them right away. One other thing I should compliment this game on, one thing that drives me crazy in a lot of games, is that a lot of the secondary characters actually change outfits. One thing that has been, I don't understand. I mean, even just changing the color palette would be enough, but many games have characters that are not the main character that constantly show up in the exact same clothes every single day. It is ridiculous. Now, if we have one or two characters that do that, that can be an eccentricity. You kind of go, okay, that guy's just a little weird and he wears the same outfit all the time. But when games have every character always looking the same, it does become a little odd. It does break the immersion. Death Stranding handles it better. It's not completely devoid of that. Most of the secondary, like the preppers, the people you are making deliveries to and for, many of them always have the same outfit on, and that becomes a little bit kind of, oh, really, they couldn't change their shirt. But the Del Toro character, Deadman, he changes his outfit 3 or 4 times. He's always wearing the same basic outfit, but the colors change. Heartman I've only seen once, but Die Hard Man, I think he's always wearing the same colors, but I'm pretty sure he's wearing different vests with different textures. There is variation in what he's wearing, so I've noticed that. That's great. So that's a little detail, but it does help to sell the world. There are other characters that always show up and look the same. That's more acceptable in the worker characters, the ones who seem to be working or are in a professional setting with like a jumpsuit on for protection. That makes sense. You would always wear the same jumpsuit that represents your company. So I get that. But then there are characters that are wearing casual wear and they're always wearing the same thing. Death Stranding does better than most games with that, but still has that problem. And that's not really a graphical problem. It's more of a, it doesn't make sense in a world where they don't specifically call out that there's a clothing shortage, that everybody would always be wearing the same stuff. Even Sam, your character, when he goes into the private rooms, he's always wearing the same stuff underneath his jumpsuit. Now, his jumpsuit, I get, would always be the same because it's a special material that's timefall resistant. But it should change what he's wearing underneath, especially when he takes a shower or uses the bathroom. You're putting on the same clothes all the time? Again, if there's a storytelling element to it, I've missed it or it wasn't obvious. But I think it's just more of games just don't pay attention that much, and it's just a nitpick that I always pick up on. But this is minor stuff. Overall, the game looks and sounds incredible. The UI has the same small font problem that many games have. There's a lot of menus to go through. But they are, you very quickly pick up the visual language of what you're looking at, the materials and different things that you see, and you'll probably see some of this behind as I'm talking. They have good iconography. You can recognize right away how things are laid out, what they are, the way the vehicles show up on the map when you do your pulse. There's different colorations, there's different symbols to indicate things. You pick up the language, the vocabulary of the world very quickly. So it is well defined. It does stick out. They do emphasize the right things. There's a lot of very smart graphical detail put into making sure the player understands what they're seeing and why they're seeing it. Even some of the weapons in the menus are color-coded, so you have an instant recognition of what they're used for. Red, example, for blood, because blood is a major weapon in this game against the undead characters. And so then, it's intelligently set up so that you will recognize something if you're trying to flip through things quickly. And you'll see that in some of this video if you're looking at it. Well, you would be looking at it. You'll see how I whip through menus very quickly in many cases because I already know what each of the things are. So there's a familiarity that develops, again, because the menus are well laid out, the weapons are well laid out, everything has a logical sense to it. And again, the sound design, it's minimal, but it's very effective when it's deployed. I think that's actually probably the best way to handle this type of game, where, again, the emptiness is part of the game. So to have the soundtrack recede, except when necessary, and that also highlights how good some of the sound effects are. It does let you really start to feel the life of the world, a world that is artificially dead in some ways, because people aren't really gone, they're just spread out all over the place, or the things that are left there are these undead creatures, but they're not everywhere. So the fact that the music falls back a lot of the time, it emphasizes the reality of where your character is. And in that way, I think it's actually a very smart use. So visuals and sound, this is one of the best showpiece games you could probably have. It really looks great. It sounds great. It uses surround very well if you have a surround system or if you're using headphones. I think they've balanced the use of music in important scenes, which also boosts the cutscenes because music is present there a lot. So that also helps there. It does reinforce the importance of the cutscenes or certain moments within them. But then the game itself becomes more realistic. It's almost like the cutscenes are the movie part and the game is the game. They work together, but they do sort of operate independently in some ways because of the way sound is used. But everything always looks really good, which is not really a surprise because it's using the engine from, or at least it was developed from the engine for Horizon Zero Dawn, which was another stellar-looking game. So I'm not really surprised at how good this looks because there were really beautiful moments in that game too, including the character models, the environments, some of the creatures that were in it. So this was taking a good base and building upon it, and I think it works out really well. So now, the final part of this, which, again, I haven't finished the game, but I've already seen certain things in the narrative that I think are worth discussing, and the next segment will probably be the shortest one, because I haven't finished the game. But I have my thoughts on why that really doesn't matter. So we've covered graphics, visuals, and the gameplay itself. Now let's move on to the narrative. Now we get to what is always a sticky topic when it comes to Hideo Kojima games, which is the storytelling and the narrative, which are things that Kojima has gotten criticism as time has gone on, I think ever since Metal Gear Solid 1. So I am at I'm in between chapter 5 and 6. I completed chapter 5. I haven't completed chapter 6 yet. So I'm approaching the roughly 50% mark in the game. And I had read some of the criticism of the storytelling decisions, some of the things that people had major problems with, and I have encountered 3 of the 4 biggest things. And the fourth thing is just an email, which I saw a discussion of, so I don't really need to read it, so I don't really check to see if it's there. But the biggest complaints have been, in this game, but also in the past, has been the handling of female characters. And I don't know about Metal Gear Solid 2, but certainly the first game, Snake Eater, I think, did better. Metal Gear Solid 4 had some questionable decisions. Certainly, Metal Gear Solid 5 famously had the quiet character who was ridiculous no matter how you look at it. So bafflingly dumb to try to defend that character's appearance that it is baffling to some degree that he even tried. And now we come to this game where one of the characters, and I'll keep this spoiler-free as much as possible, there is a character that is forced to strip nearly naked, and I don't think it's that particular part of the storytelling that people have a problem with. It's the way the camera leers on certain parts of her anatomy. And when the scene happened, at first I was looking at it going, okay, this makes sense. I understand what's being done here. This narratively does have a purpose. And then the camera started moving and it became obvious what people were bothered by. Now, I have no idea what is in Kojima's mind. I can't speak to it. I haven't really seen a lot of interviews with him where he talked about it. I don't know him in any way. I am no type of storytelling critic or master of analysis. I can only tell you what I see in these games. And to start off with, none of it has ever bothered me because I don't ever take any of this stuff too seriously. Meaning, I have never found a female character model in a game to be attractive in any way. That bridge has never been crossed where I went, oh, this is so real that I can respond to this like it's a real female character. I just always know what it is. It's just a fictional computer-generated polygon model. So part of it is that I'm naturally segmented off from any type of attraction to these characters. The other side of it is this has always felt to me less like, and again, this is pure speculation, but this has always felt less like a genuine misogynistic or anti-female commentary or some way, or a disregard for women. It has always just felt like a juvenile way of depicting characters, meaning it's just something Kojima likes to see in his games. I think, again, I don't know, but this has always felt like he has more of an investment. I'm going to say this as diplomatically as possible. He has more of an attraction to the models in his games and probably the people who represent them or depict them for him. So he likes to leer in a way that others don't. Do I think that means that the characters are problematic? Sure. Have I ever felt like it has been some type of actually negative stereotypical mindset? I don't know. It's tougher to ascribe a motive to it, but it is definitely here. And I think in that sense, I think some people were wondering, and I'd seen some people wondering if being separated from Metal Gear Solid would allow Kojima to grow a bit as a storyteller. And I think for good or ill, he hasn't. This is the same basic narrative storytelling approach that he has used since... I didn't play anything of his pre-Metal Gear Solid. I did play the Nintendo games, but I don't think there was as much of modern storytelling in those games as there is now. I don't really remember them, to be honest. So I'm just going to go from Metal Gear Solid 1 on. His storytelling approach has been largely consistent and remains so in Death Stranding. Very long cutscenes, very on-the-nose storytelling, depictions of women that will be problematic for some people, some commentary on cultural and world things, I'm going to try to keep this as vague as possible, that will probably bother some people. But do I think that any of it comes from an actual ill will? It's tougher to say that. But, I don't want to delegitimize anybody who has a problem with these elements. I understand I'm not a writer. I'm not a woman. Therefore, I will not respond to these things the way somebody who is a writer, or is a woman, or is both, might. Or any other type of class that might be bothered by some of the opinions that are in this game. There's an email that a lot of people are focusing on that I think is getting a little too much focus, because I don't know that it's really, because it is not prominently put into the game, I don't know how much value we're supposed to put on that. It's tough to say. But again, I can only respond to things from my perspective. And even from my detached perspective, I find the treatment of women to be not great. Do I think it is, again, coming from an ill will towards women, something that is actually, legitimately negative? It's tough for me to say that. Again, because I don't know Kojima at all. I've never seen anything where he explains why he does certain things. I think at this point, it's tough to know whether it's even... To some degree, I wonder if he's just doing it now to some degree to just irritate people, to be provocative. Because certainly in the response that he had to Quiet, he had to know that nobody was going to actually believe that that was a legitimate excuse. I think he just wanted to see a woman who was in very skimpy clothing slinking around and firing a sniper rifle. I mean, that's certainly not unique to him. There is a lot of that on the internet if you go looking for it. Does it mean that it's a positive representation or even a fair representation of women? No, I'm not going to make an argument that it is. So the overall thing from this is, if you've been bothered by some of the things that he's done in the past, you're still going to be bothered. The storytelling is not really any different than it's always been. That also has a benefit, to the degree that I like these soap operatic, nonsensically on the nose, drawn out movie style cutscenes. I've always liked those. I've always found those to be amusing to me in a way where, you have these long stretches of gameplay and then you just have these overwrought, dramatic scenes with these characters spouting just pure nonsense. And that's how it goes. So again, if you've enjoyed the games up to now that he has been a part of, you are likely, at least narratively, going to enjoy this one too. The gameplay, that's the more divisive element. It really is. But storytelling-wise, I can detect no difference in this than I did in Metal Gear Solid 3, 4, 5. Really, you could almost swap some of these characters out and it would still work. If this was Solid Snake in the future, nothing would really have to be altered all that much. It really wouldn't. I mean, this would largely be the same game. So, from a storytelling perspective, I haven't finished it, so I don't know how the story resolves, but I really don't care, because I sort of already know what I'm going to get. And again, because I have enjoyed his hyper, overextended storytelling technique, that doesn't bother me. So whatever the explanations or whatever the story resolutions are, it really doesn't matter. It's not going to. I haven't read anybody who said that he tanked the ending in any major way, so that was all I was really trying to see is, okay, is he really blow the ending? Nobody is saying that. But I think what was more important to me was, did his storytelling change? Was this something different? Which is not to say that I wouldn't want to see a evolved approach where there is a little bit more deliberation and thought, but at the same time, I'm just glad that we didn't suddenly get some kind of reinvention that tanks the way he approaches things. So in this case, consistency may not be ideal, but it is certainly not bad. He did not somehow regress. It didn't get worse. That was actually something that I wasn't sure about, was without any real restraint, would some of his more debatable choices get worse? And it doesn't appear that they have. So that's something to hold on to. Again, I'm saying this for people who may have been struggling with some of the things that he's done in the past. You're still going to struggle with them. But I still love his visual sense. I still love the way that he has his characters maneuver through the world. I genuinely enjoy some of the narrative decisions that he makes. Some are bad, or problematic at least, but others are quite beautiful and wonderful, and I enjoy a storyteller who is not necessarily overly concerned with everything having to be explained and make sense and be logical and rational. I am okay with vagary. I am okay with the idea of symbolism and the sometimes embrace of imagery over logic. That not everything needs to be narratively explained. That is not a problem for me. If that has been a problem for you in his games in the past, or you've been afraid that it would get... That particular thing, the embrace of the symbolic... I don't know, though. Phantom Pain had a lot of that. So it's tough to say whether that has expanded or not. But the basics are, the very simple approach in the explanation of the narrative is, if you were expecting something to change, it hasn't. If that's good, you're going to enjoy the narrative. If that's something that you were kind of on the fence as far as whether you would play another game, you might not want to pick this up. So it is, in some ways, this is the aspect of the game that is the most similar to everything he's done before. It is the area where there doesn't seem to be much evolution. That, for some people, will be positive. For some people, it will be negative. But that's what it is. So that's the easiest way to sum up the narrative. Now, everybody who's in it does a great job with it. I mean, the voice acting is very good. The motion capture, I think, conveys the emotions of the characters very well. There are some neat moments in it where there's some interesting decisions that are made. So not all necessarily... I mean, one character... There was another criticism that all the characters in this game are functionally just women, or just wombs. The women are wombs, and that's it. I don't agree with that. Now, again, this is just my perspective, but I think in particular there's one character who I think really kind of cuts that argument in half. Again, I don't want to get into spoilers, but that I think is a little overblown. Again, not to gloss over that there are some problematic things going on in here, at least for me. So some people, I think, are still going to, and have, as far as the criticisms I've seen, are going to struggle with some of the things that he does. But in the broader sense, if you came from more of the wacky storytelling that you got out of the Metal Gear Solid series, that is mostly preserved in a new universe. So just be aware that like I said, in this regard, where it comes to narrative and storytelling, nothing much has changed. And that is kind of the easiest way to sum up the narrative. So now we'll get to... I guess I'll sum everything up. So next segment will just be my overall thoughts on the game, which you probably already can kind of guess from all of these, and that'll be it. So in the end, after all of this discussion and me going on and on and on about different things, what do I think of Death Stranding? I don't think this is any shock. I absolutely adore this game. I love it. I have been playing it since I got it and have not played anything else outside of Breakpoint when Lando's around, just for the co-op. Outside of that, I have loved being in this world that is solitary and isolated and alone, and doing things, being in a game where I am encouraged to help people in ways that will never be directly recognized. It's helping somebody with no immediate recognition of it. A world that is both desolate and depressing and crumbling, and being the person who is tasked with building that world positively back to what it used to be, in reconnecting people, in remaking the country as one, as a whole, and actually endeavoring to make people be more in touch with one another. It is a wonderful message. I mean, at its core, this game's primary driver is we're all in it together. And that is something that most games don't really do, or they do it in speech. They say it, but they don't really demonstrate it through the gameplay. And this game absolutely demonstrates it through the gameplay. You, as the main character, suffer and work and toil for the benefit of everyone but yourself. You, as a character, don't really benefit. And the fact that the game is okay with that, and in fact has structured its entire gameplay loop around that, around you doing something for someone else, is, I think, something to be celebrated, and it's wonderful, and it's different, and in an environment where we get the same versions of the same games that are largely built on competition or wanton destruction or murder, all stuff that's fun. I play these games too, so don't get me wrong. I'm not making some kind of moral judgment or saying that we shouldn't be playing these games, but we have a lot of that. We have a flood of it. Whereas this game is something very, very different. It's saying, no, the whole point of this game is to try to get people to be back together again, to try to make things better, as opposed to tear things down, to wipe out the opponent, to be competitive with somebody else, to win, to be victorious. No, the goal is get everybody back on the same page, heal a massive wound that has affected this whole country. And I think it succeeds wonderfully in that endeavor. The gameplay is great. If you like it, again, I'm going to preface, I have to say, if you don't like what you're seeing of the gameplay, you're not going to like the game. This is not a Metal Gear Solid 2 where it's a fake out that this is a delivery game. It is a delivery game. But once you're in it, once you're playing it, once you allow yourself to get absorbed into that world, it really feels like something fresh and new and different and, frankly, optimistic. And it doesn't look that way. You look at the gameplay, it looks miserable. And in fact, the country as it starts out is miserable. People are cut off from each other. There are people you run into who are very distrusting, paranoid, don't want to be involved anymore. There's a lot of fear. Obviously, these dead things floating around causes a lot of tension. There's always a risk of these huge explosions. But as the game goes on, the characters in the environment respond to you as the player in only positive ways. They're grateful. They're happy to be talking to somebody again, even though most of the time you don't actually interact with them directly. Very few times do you see anything other than a hologram. But still, there's this real gratitude that all the players express. And all the encouragement when you succeed in a mission, it's all positive. It's all, you're doing great work. This is wonderful. You're getting the country built up again. You're getting people to talk to each other again. It is so strangely positive for a modern game of this scale and this really just beauty that I was in love with it within a couple hours. And I was sort of always going to be, because I'm into Kojima's stuff and I think he does really interesting things with his gameplay and with his narrative, even if it is bonkers. But Death Stranding does feel like the logical next step for him. You know, taking a game in a different direction, not necessarily its own genre. Again, I don't really think this is its own genre. It's adventure puzzle solving, really, if you break it down. But its viewpoint, its positivity, its message of trying to get people back together, that is something that's really just great to see in a game. A game that's this entertaining and this wonderful to look at. So I can't recommend it highly enough if it's a game that looks at all interesting to you, or if you've liked Kojima's other games, then there's a good chance you're going to like this too. But it is definitely not a game for everybody. Not that Metal Gear Solid necessarily was either. A lot of people who don't like Metal Gear Solid's actual gameplay. So this is yet another Kojima game that's for a very specific audience. But I think if you're a member of that audience, this is a really stellar effort that shows that even separated from an established brand like Metal Gear Solid, Kojima still knows how to make a great game. So if you play it, I hope you enjoy it even a quarter as much as I am right now, because it's a really magnificent experience. And I don't feel let down at all for all the build-up that this game has had, all this long development. I think because I never really expected it to be anything. The fact that it delivers on that feeling that the Metal Gear Solid games used to give me in a different way is probably the best possible result. I love it. I think it's absolutely worth playing. If you're up for this experience, then I think you're going to get something wonderful out of it. And I hope this hasn't just been a complete waste of a review. I hope people have enjoyed this and got something a little different than just a normal standard review out of it. And that's it. Go play the game and have fun with it.